This video contains spoilers for the entirety of Dark Souls 2 and all 3 of its DLCs. Dark Souls 2's third and final DLC takes you to the frozen city of Ilium Lois. The DLC's primary objective seems to be experimenting with novel and innovative concepts that don't appear in the base game. Each section feels like it's testing the waters of a new idea, from dynamic weather conditions to the variety of unique NPCs scattered around the world. This is one of my favorite parts about the DLC. It's trying to push the envelope and try risky new ideas, experience that From will benefit from as they develop Bloodborne. One of the most significant features in the DLC is the weather system. The player spends most of the DLC navigating through the interior of Ilium Lois, which is initially undergoing a blizzard. On their first pass through this area, players will notice that portions of the stage are inaccessible due to environmental hazards. However, this sometimes works in the player's favor by providing natural barriers against enemies' attacks. Once the blizzard is cleared away after the first boss fight, players can go back and re-explore the city. This is an incredibly rewarding experience and a great example of backtracking done well. Each section of the city has subtly changed. New areas are explorable, previously inaccessible nooks contain items you couldn't previously get to, and ninja-like enemies that were previously passive sneak up and backstab you if you don't proactively kill them. One particularly memorable moment was killing a mimic that had previously been frozen in ice. The game is actively rewarding players who are diligent in exploring and keeping an eye on their surroundings. This never feels tedious. Even though you've been through this section before, it still feels fresh and interesting. The primary purpose of re-exploring the city is to free NPC followers that assist you in the final boss fight. Along the way, players unlock a number of shortcuts and other hidden areas that they could previously see, but not get to. However, the shortcuts aren't designed to be very meaningful. Shortcuts work well when they reward the player for their exploration and provide a sense of relief for being able to skip difficult sections. Instead, shortcuts here serve merely to move the player forward in a new and novel way. I would have preferred to see more meaningful shortcuts and fewer bonfires to make opening a shortcut a more significant reward. I will, however, gladly point out that the DLC contains one of the coolest shortcuts in the entire series. The enemy placement in the interior of the city is pretty good. While the blizzard is in effect, players encounter fewer enemies and are able to leverage thick walls of ice as environmental barriers. Once the blizzard clears, players have improved vision and better familiar with the layout of the area, but the game adds additional enemies and removes barriers to compensate. Enemies complement each other well, with ranged enemies supporting melee enemies that charge the player. One notable example of a great enemy placement is a hexer that invades under the bridge. He invades as soon as a player comes in sight of a sniper mage. Smart players will backtrack to get better positioning. A couple of issues from the base game still crop up from time to time. Enemy leashing can sometimes be too aggressive and pull enemies back in nonsensical ways. Multiple mobbing melee enemies in interior areas sometimes felt unnecessary and cheap, particularly when I ran through on my sorcery build. The NPC followers freed by re-exploring the city assist in the final boss fight, helping with the waves of incoming enemies, and sacrificing themselves to prevent more adds from being spawned. I appreciate that From is trying something new here, but its execution is very poor. First, the combat system in Dark Souls 2 is not designed for fighting multiple enemies at once. The best strategy in most fights is to be patient and methodical, understanding your enemy's moveset and exploiting it. Attacks are not fast, health goes quickly, and only a few actions can be taken before the stamina bar is empty. This is usually a strength of the combat system, rewarding players for figuring out what to do instead of button mashing their way through the game. Second, the enemy AI in the Souls series has never been particularly fast. It's common to wait for an enemy to figure out what they want to do while you wait for an opening. Again, this is usually a good thing, not a bad one. It rewards patient and smart players. Taking these things into consideration, it's easy to see what goes wrong in the final boss fight. Your friendly followers often stand in the middle of the battle doing nothing, trying to figure out what to do as enemies wail on them. It's challenging to avoid taking damage because several enemies are attacking you at once with AoEs and large sweeping swings. Enemies interrupt themselves in the middle of the fight to turn around and go after you, all while your allies stand around and wonder what they should be doing. The battle never really feels coherent. Instead, it just comes across as cheap and unpredictable. Once the initial brawl is finished, you face the Ivory King. Your followers block the entryways of add-on enemies, allowing you to fight the boss one-on-one. Problematically, your followers sometimes wait an unpredictable amount of time to do this, making them come across as needlessly unreliable. The irony of all this is that the follower mechanic is completely unnecessary. The boss fight by itself is incredibly good. The boss has a unique and interesting moveset, the arena is gorgeous and fun to fight in, and the descent into the area is highly memorable. The followers don't add anything to the narrative or to the gameplay. From could have had players simply flip switches that prevent adds from being added to the fight to begin with. This would provide the same reward for exploration without adding the needless headache of dealing with NPC followers. The DLC also experiments with the AI of NPC invaders. My favorite was the invader who uses a Lloyd's talisman to blend into the environment, backstabbing you when you try to open a chest. One invader that I consider to be a miss, however, is a white phantom that is initially non-hostile, but eventually backstabs you, runs away, heals, and throws corrosive bombs. I understand the intent here. From is trying to troll players the same way players troll each other online. Unfortunately, From doesn't seem to understand the purpose of pranks. The point is the interaction between two human beings. Even troll moments in games are still fundamentally a person-to-person interaction. They're a prank that the developer is playing on you. In contrast, there's no real interaction with an NPC AI. Having a computer arbitrarily screw you over just makes you feel, well, screwed over. It's pointless and breaks immersion. Aside from the Ivory King, the DLC offers two other boss fights. The first is with Ava, a large cat. Players who fail to explore the city prior to entering this fight will find themselves fighting an invisible boss. I thought this was a pretty cool mechanic, but I was disappointed by how heavy-handed From was about telling players to go back and get an item prior to trying again. I prefer that they trust players to be smart enough to make the right decisions for themselves. This also gives the development team more freedom in their creative decisions. Once players get the Eye of the Priestess, they can see and fight Ava like a normal boss. This fight is visually stunning and very well designed. Ava hits hard, but openly choreographs her attacks. In contrast with other fights with four-legged animals, players can't simply hide underneath her because of her AoE attack. The arena is long, showcasing Ava's movement and agility and allowing her to show off her lunging bite attack. However, it can also feel incredibly cramped if players fail to get into a good position. The NPC summons are just retreads from the base game and prior DLCs, although I think players who summon NPCs for this fight will miss some of the magic. The optional boss fight with Lud and Zalin, in contrast, is poorly done. This fight follows the format of the Man-Eaters, Gargoyles, and Dark Lurker. After getting the first cat down to half health, the second cat joins the fight. This format simply doesn't work here, and let me explain why. First, the Man-Eaters, Gargoyles, and Dark Lurker are all unique enemies. You hadn't encountered them before, and you don't encounter them again. Fighting even one of them feels like a challenge on its own. In contrast, the player has already defeated Ava in order to get to this fight. There's nothing new or novel about it, just two of an enemy that the player has already encountered and defeated. Second, the previous three examples make an effort to compensate for the additional enemy. The Man-Eaters offer a central fighting area where you can fight them one at a time. The second Gargoyle spawns with half health. The Dark Lurker's attacks are extremely slow and clearly choreographed, so keeping track of two attack patterns is challenging but not impossible. In contrast, Lud and Zalin do none of these things. Fighting one of them fills up your entire screen, allowing the other's AoE and homing magic attacks to get you out of nowhere. The cats aren't easy to separate, and even when you do get down to one, she turns on a health regeneration buff. I have no idea what the intent of this fight was, but as implemented, it's both boring and unfair. In order to get to Lud and Zalin, players navigate through the last area of the DLC, the Frigid Outskirts. Here, a blizzard periodically turns on and off, limiting visibility. There's no obvious path to follow, but a number of houses act as landmarks. The combination of dynamic weather and a wide open area feels like a fresh new idea relative to the base game. Unfortunately, this is the most poorly designed area in all of Dark Souls 2. First, it's incredibly unfair. The stag enemies that charge at players aren't visible until they've already aggroed. This means players cannot inadvertently avoid aggroing multiple enemies at once. Even players who move at a snail's pace will find that just moving around to fight a stag is enough to draw another one. The game is at its best when it rewards strategic and smart players. In contrast, this feels arbitrary and random. Second, there's no sense of progress. There's no bonfire at the end of the outskirts. Players have to walk through this area each time they'd like to get to the boss fight. This makes no sense. The interior of Ilium Lois is filled with needless bonfires that should have been replaced by shortcuts, yet the most frustrating and arbitrary section of the game has no checkpoint at the end. Finally, it's poorly programmed. The hitbox on the stag's charge attack is nonsense. The previous 2 DLCs also included this kind of area, with a gauntlet of enemies thrown at a player prior to the boss. These areas are all designed to be done in co-op. This bothers me to begin with because I feel that your first playthrough is most rewarding when done offline and without summons. It seemed like the previous 2 DLCs addressed this by enabling good players to dodge roll their way back to the boss fairly easily. This one doesn't, making the area feel like tedious, frustrating filler. Upon completing the DLC, if the players collected all 3 DLC crowns and Vendrick's crown, they are treated to a short and unique cutscene with Vendrick. I loved how this was done. It was fun to chat up Vendrick at the end of each DLC and get a sense of progress. At the end of the final cutscene, players' DLC crowns enable them to no longer go hollow or get cursed. It's a worthy reward that really makes you feel like you've beaten the game. Constructing a cohesive ending for something as long and complex as Dark Souls 2 is challenging, and I'm pleased with the simple, straightforward approach FromSoft took here. Overall, the Crown of the Ivory King tries a number of new and innovative ideas. I'm appreciative when game developers are willing to take risks and try new things, even more so when they mostly work out for the best, as they do here. The DLC does suffer from some of the same flaws as the base game, such as unfair difficulty and multiple enemies in a boss fight. On the whole, I was pleased with my experience with the DLC, very happy with the way they decided to end the game, and it's only gotten me more excited for Bloodborne.